The Thompson family lived in a small, peaceful town called Willow Creek. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other, and life moved at a slow, predictable pace. The streets were lined with old oak trees, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. Kids rode bicycles down winding roads, laughter echoing through the air as they played until sunset. Among these families was the Thompson household, a close-knit trio consisting of Sarah, Mark, and their only child, Ethan. Ethan was the heart and soul of the family. At just 17 years old, he had already made a name for himself in the community. He was bright, curious, and always eager to explore the world around him. Whether it was tinkering with gadgets in his makeshift workshop or hiking up trails in the nearby woods, Ethan's adventurous spirit shone brightly. His dream was to become an engineer, designing machines that could change people's lives for the better. Sarah and Mark often joked that if anyone could make impossible ideas come true, it would be their son. Every evening, the Thompsons gathered around the dinner table to share stories about their day. Ethan would talk animatedly about school projects, his latest inventions, or plans for future adventures. Sarah listened intently, her eyes lighting up with pride, while Mark chimed in with playful teasing. These moments were precious to them, simple, yet full of love. They cherished every second because deep down they knew how fleeting time could be. But fate has a way of testing even the strongest bonds. One crisp autumn afternoon, everything changed forever. Ethan had planned a solo hike along his favorite trail, a path he'd walked countless times before. "I'll be back before dark," he promised his parents with a confident grin. Armed with a backpack full of snacks and water, he set off into the forest, waving goodbye as he disappeared between the towering trees. Little did anyone know, this would be the last time they saw him alive. Hours passed and darkness fell over Willow Creek. When Ethan failed to return home, panic began to creep into Sarah and Mark's hearts. They tried calling his phone, but there was no answer. Neighbors joined the search party, combing through the woods with flashlights and calling out his name. The once familiar trail now felt ominous under the pale moonlight. As the night wore on, hope dwindled, replaced by a growing sense of dread. By morning, the grim reality became undeniable. Ethan's body was discovered near the edge of the forest, close to a rocky slope where hikers rarely ventured. Authorities quickly ruled his death an accident, suggesting he might have slipped and fallen during his hike. But something about the explanation didn't sit right with Sarah and Mark. Why would Ethan venture off the beaten path? He was cautious and well-versed in outdoor safety. Something didn't add up, but without evidence to support their doubts, all they could do was grieve. In the weeks that followed, life in the Thompson household ground to a halt. Meals went uneaten, conversations dwindled to silence, and the house felt emptier than ever. Pictures of Ethan adorned every surface, a constant reminder of the vibrant young man who was no longer there. Friends and neighbors stopped by to offer condolences, but words felt hollow against the weight of their loss. Grief consumed Sarah and Mark, pulling them deeper into despair with each passing day. Yet amidst the sorrow, strange thoughts began to nag at Sarah. She remembered Ethan mentioning odd occurrences during his hikes in the months leading up to his death. He'd casually remarked about feeling like someone was watching him from the shadows, though he brushed it off as paranoia. At the time, Sarah hadn't given it much thought, chalking it up to her son's overactive imagination. Now, those comments, replayed in her mind like a broken record, raising unsettling questions she couldn't ignore. As winter approached, the pain remained raw. Visiting Ethan's grave became a daily ritual for Sarah and Mark. It was their way of staying connected to him, even if only in memory. The cemetery sat atop a hill overlooking the town, its rows of headstones bathed in golden sunlight during the day and shrouded in mist at night. Each visit brought a mix of comfort and anguish, as they spoke to Ethan as though he were still listening. One chilly afternoon, as Sarah placed fresh flowers on the grave, she noticed something unusual. Standing a few feet away was a figure clad in dark clothing, their face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. The person knelt silently by Ethan's headstone, leaving behind a bouquet of wildflowers. Before Sarah could approach to ask who they were, the stranger turned and vanished into the woods, leaving barely a trace. Confused and unsettled, Sarah hurried back to Mark to tell him what she'd seen. Who was this mysterious visitor, and why? Had they come to pay respects to Ethan? The encounter left Sarah and Mark with more questions than answers. Was this person connected to Ethan's death? Or were they simply another grieving soul touched by his memory? Whatever the reason, the sight of the stranger lingered in their minds long after the sun had set, casting an eerie shadow over their already fragile peace. The mysterious figure at Ethan's grave haunted Sarah and Mark in ways they couldn't quite explain. It wasn't just the suddenness of the encounter or the stranger's deliberate avoidance. It was the unsettling feeling that this person knew something about their son, something they weren't sharing. Who were they? Why had they come to pay respects to someone they'd never met? And most importantly, what was their connection to Ethan? For days after the sighting, Sarah found herself unable to focus on anything else. Her mind replayed the moment over and over, the dark clothing, the quiet demeanor, the way the figure disappeared into the woods as if they belonged there. She tried to convince herself it was nothing more than a coincidence, a passerby moved by Ethan's story, but deep down she knew better. There was something off about the entire situation, something that gnawed at her instincts. Mark, too, was troubled, though he tried to hide it behind a stoic exterior. He spent hours poring over news articles and online forums, searching for any mention of similar incidents involving strangers visiting grave sites. But no matter how hard he looked, he couldn't find anything that matched what they'd experienced. The lack of answers only fueled his frustration. Maybe it's just someone who heard about Ethan, he suggested one evening, though even he didn't sound convinced. People do strange things when they're grieving, but Sarah wasn't so sure. Memories of Ethan's cryptic comments about being watched began to resurface with alarming clarity. He had mentioned it casually during dinner one night, saying he felt like eyes were following him whenever he went hiking. At the time, Sarah had dismissed it as paranoia or an overactive imagination. Ethan often joked about having a sixth sense for danger. Now, however, those words took on a sinister tone. Could the stranger have been watching Ethan before his death? If so, why? Determined to get to the bottom of things, Sarah decided to visit the cemetery again. This time she went alone, hoping to catch another glimpse of the figure. Armed with a thermos of coffee and a notebook, she arrived early in the morning, when the air was crisp and the ground still damp with dew. She sat on a bench near Ethan's grave, pretending to read while keeping a close eye on her surroundings. Hours passed, but the stranger didn't appear. By mid-afternoon, Sarah reluctantly gave up and headed home, her resolve stronger than ever. That night, as she lay awake staring at the ceiling, Sarah realized they needed proof. Without evidence, all they had were suspicions, and suspicions wouldn't bring them closer to understanding what had happened to Ethan. An idea began to form in her mind, one that seemed both logical and slightly invasive. What if they installed a security camera near Ethan's grave? It wasn't uncommon for cemeteries to use surveillance systems to deter vandalism, and many families opted for private cameras to monitor their loved ones' resting places. Surely, no one would object to such a measure under the circumstances. Sarah broached the subject with Mark the next morning over breakfast. "I know it sounds extreme," she admitted, stirring sugar into her tea. "But what if we put up a camera? Just for a little while? Maybe we'll finally get some answers." Mark hesitated, his fork hovering above his plate. The thought of spying on Ethan's grave felt wrong, almost disrespectful. Yet he couldn't deny the practicality of Sarah's suggestion. If the stranger returned, they might capture footage that could shed light on their intentions, or reveal something far more sinister. After much deliberation, they agreed to move forward with the plan. Choosing a discreet model that blended seamlessly with the environment, they hired a local technician to install the camera. Positioned high on a nearby tree, it offered a clear view of Ethan, source. With the camera installed discreetly above Ethan's grave, Sarah and Mark felt a mix of relief and unease. On one hand, They were finally taking action to uncover the truth about the mysterious visitor. On the other hand, the weight of their decision hung heavily over them. Was it right to monitor something as sacred as their son's final resting place? The question lingered in their minds, but the need for answers outweighed their doubts. The first few days after setting up the camera were uneventful. Each evening, Mark would sit at the kitchen table with his laptop, reviewing the footage while Sarah paced nervously behind him. The recording showed little more than the usual activity: wind rustling through the trees, birds flitting between branches, and an occasional squirrel darting across the screen. Occasionally, neighbors or friends visited Ethan's grave, leaving flowers or pausing for a moment of quiet reflection. But there was no sign of the shadowy figure who had sparked this entire investigation. Despite the lack of evidence, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching. She found herself glancing out the window at odd hours, half expecting to see the stranger lurking nearby. Her sleep became restless, filled with vivid dreams of dark figures slipping through the woods. Mark tried to reassure her, reminding her that patience was key. "If they're coming back, we'll catch them," he said firmly, though even he couldn't hide the tension in his voice. As the days turned into a week, the routine began to wear on them. Reviewing hours of empty footage felt tedious, almost futile. Yet neither Sarah nor Mark could bring themselves to give up. They clung to the hope that the camera would eventually reveal something, anything, that might explain the strange events surrounding Ethan's death. Their determination was fueled not just by curiosity, but by a deep-seated desire for closure. Every unanswered question gnawed at them, reopening wounds they thought would heal with time. Then, on the fifth night, everything changed. Mark was scrolling through the latest batch of footage when he froze, his eyes widening in shock. "Sarah," he called hoarsely, waving her over. She rushed to his side, heart pounding as she leaned in to look at the screen. At first, all she saw was the familiar scene: the moon casting its pale glow over the cemetery, the gravestones standing silent sentinels in the darkness. But then movement caught her eye, a shadow detaching itself from the tree line and moving deliberately toward Ethan's grave. The figure was unmistakable. Dressed in the same dark clothing as before, they moved with slow, deliberate steps, their face obscured by the brim of a wide hat. For a moment, they simply stood there, gazing down at the headstone as if lost in thought. Then, without warning, they knelt beside the grave, their hands brushing against the cold stone. Sarah gasped, clutching Mark's arm tightly. Neither of them dared to breathe as they watched the figure whisper something inaudible, their lips moving silently in the dim light. But the strangest part was yet to come. After finishing whatever silent ritual they were performing, the figure reached into their coat and pulled out a small object. With great care, they placed it atop Ethan's headstone before rising to their feet and retreating back into the woods. The entire sequence lasted less than 2 minutes, but it left Sarah and Mark staring at the screen in stunned silence. What had the figure left behind, and why? The next morning, unable to wait any longer, Sarah and Mark hurried to the cemetery. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of pine needles and damp earth. As they approached Ethan's grave, their footsteps slowed, anticipation building with each step. When they finally reached the headstone, they spotted it immediately, the mysterious object left by the stranger. It was a silver locket, delicate and intricately designed, with initials engraved on its surface. Sarah picked it up gingerly, her fingers trembling as she examined it. The initials didn't match anyone in their family, which only deepened the mystery. Inside the locket was a faded photograph of Ethan as a child, smiling widely with a gap-toothed grin. Sarah's breath hitched as tears welled up in her eyes. How did this stranger have such a personal keepsake? Who were they, and why were they leaving mementos tied to Ethan's past? Mark stared at the locket, his brow furrowed in confusion. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered under his breath. "How does this person know so much about Ethan, and why are they doing this now?" Sarah shook her head, unable to form words. The discovery raised more questions than it answered, leaving them both shaken. They debated whether to take the locket to the police, but ultimately decided against. It's something about the situation felt too intimate, too private to share with authorities. Instead, they resolved to dig deeper on their own, hoping to piece together the puzzle themselves. Over the next few days, Sarah scoured every inch of the locket for clues. She examined the engraving closely, wondering if the initials belonged to someone connected to Ethan's life. She also took the photograph out carefully, holding it up to the light to see if there were any hidden markings or notes on the back. Meanwhile, Mark continued to review the camera footage, searching for anything they might have missed during their initial viewing. The more they uncovered, the clearer it became that this wasn't a random act. It was deliberate, calculated, and deeply personal. Their minds raced with possibilities. Could the stranger be someone Ethan had met during his hikes, someone who had formed an attachment to him without their knowledge? Or was this person linked to the circumstances surrounding his death, perhaps trying to send them a message? The uncertainty gnawed at them, keeping them awake at night and fueling endless conversations about what to do next. One thing was certain: the appearance of the locket marked a turning point in their journey. No longer were they dealing with vague suspicions and fleeting sightings. They now had tangible proof that someone was deliberately inserting themselves into their lives. Whether this person intended harm or sought redemption remained unclear. But one thing was undeniable. The Thompsons were being drawn into a web of secrets that threatened to unravel everything they thought they knew about their son's life and death. The discovery of the silver locket left Sarah and Mark reeling, their minds racing with questions that seemed to multiply faster than answers. The photograph inside, a faded image of Ethan as a child, was both comforting and unsettling. It was a piece of their son's past, yet it had been placed in the hands of someone who wasn't family. Who could this stranger be? And why were they leaving such deeply personal items at Ethan's grave? Determined to uncover the truth, Sarah took the locket to a local jeweler named Mr. Harris, hoping he might shed some light on its origins. Mr. Harris was an elderly man with decades of experience repairing and identifying jewelry. His shop was tucked away on a quiet street, filled with the soft hum of machinery and the faint scent of polish. As Sarah handed him the locket, she explained the situation as vaguely as possible, careful not to reveal too much. Mr. Harris adjusted his glasses and examined the piece closely under a bright lamp. "This is quite old," he murmured, turning it over in his hands. "The craftsmanship suggests it dates back at least 30 or 40 years. Look here, the engraving style isn't common anymore." He pointed to the initials etched into the metal, E.M. Sarah frowned. Those letters meant nothing to her. They weren't connected to anyone in their immediate circle. "Is there any way to trace who made it?" Sarah asked hopefully. Mr. Harris nodded thoughtfully. "Sometimes jewelers leave tiny marks or stamps indicating where a piece was crafted. Let me check." After a few moments of inspection, he shook his head. "No visible markings, I'm afraid." But these types of lockets were often custom-made for special occasions, birthdays, anniversaries, or memorials. If you can find out who commissioned it, you might have your answer. Sarah thanked him and left the shop feeling more frustrated than before. Without a clear lead, the mystery only deepened. She returned home to find Mark hunched over his laptop, reviewing the latest footage from the cemetery camera. "Anything new?" she asked, setting the locket down on the table. Mark sighed and leaned back in his chair. "Nothing since the locket drop. But I've noticed something strange. This person. They seem to know exactly when no one else is around. Every time they visit, it's late at night, long after visitors are gone. They're careful, almost like they've done this before." Sarah shivered at the thought. Whoever this person was, they weren't acting on impulse. Their movements were calculated, deliberate. It was as though they had studied the cemetery's patterns, timing their appearances perfectly to avoid detection. "Do you think they're watching us?" she whispered, glancing toward the window. "It's possible," Mark admitted reluctantly, "but we don't know their intentions yet. Maybe they're just grieving in their own way." Grieving. Sarah couldn't help but scoff at the idea. Grief didn't explain the secrecy, the eerie precision of their visits, or the objects they kept leaving behind. Something about this whole situation felt wrong, like pieces of a puzzle that refused to fit together. Over the next several nights, the stranger continued their ritual. Each time the camera captured them placing another small item atop Ethan's grave. First, it was a toy car, an old Matchbox model that looked like it had seen better days. Then came a handwritten note folded neatly into quarters. Finally, there was a lock of hair tied with a faded ribbon. Each object seemed to carry its own significance, yet none provided concrete answers. One morning, after finding the toy car, Sarah sat at the kitchen table staring at it intently. Memories flooded back of Ethan playing with cars as a toddler, zooming them across the floor while making engine noises. Her heart ached knowing how much joy those simple toys had brought him. But why would the stranger choose this particular car? Was it random, or did it hold some deeper meaning? Meanwhile, Mark struggled to decipher the handwritten note. The paper was brittle with age, the ink smudged in places. Squinting at the words, he managed to make out fragments of sentences. Always remember. Never forget. He was special. The message was cryptic, bordering on poetic, but it offered little insight into the writer's identity. Frustrated, he set it aside and focused instead on the lock of hair. The ribbon tying the strand of hair was delicate, its edges frayed from years of wear. Mark examined it closely, noting faint stains that suggested it had once been part of a larger keepsake. Could it belong to Ethan? He compared it to photos of his son as a child, searching for similarities in color and texture. While it seemed plausible, there was no definitive proof. The uncertainty gnawed at him, leaving him restless and irritable. As the days passed, Sarah and Mark began to notice subtle changes in their own behavior. Sleep eluded them, replaced by endless hours spent analyzing every detail of the case. Conversations revolved around theories and possibilities, each one more far-fetched than the last. Friends and neighbors noticed the toll it was taking on them, urging them to take a break and focus on healing. But how could they heal when the past kept creeping back in unexpected ways? Despite the growing tension, they couldn't ignore the chilling pattern emerging from the stranger's actions. Every item left behind was tied to Ethan's childhood, a reminder of happier times before tragedy struck. Yet none of it explained why. The stranger felt compelled to revisit these memories or why they chose to share them with the Thompsons. One evening, as Sarah flipped through an old photo album, she stumbled upon a picture of Ethan holding the exact same toy car now resting on their dining table. Tears welled up in her eyes as she traced the edges of the photograph with trembling fingers. "It's like they're piecing together his life," she murmured to Mark, who sat beside her. "But why? What do they want from us?" Mark didn't have an answer. All he knew was that the line between obsession and mourning was becoming increasingly blurred. Whoever this person was, they weren't just paying respects, they were reliving Ethan's life, one memory at a time. And with each visit, the Thompsons felt themselves being pulled deeper into a world they didn't fully understand. The final straw came when the camera captured the stranger lingering longer than usual during one of their nightly visits. Instead of simply placing an object and leaving, they stood motionless by the grave for several minutes, their head bowed as if lost in thought. Then, in a sudden burst of movement, they reached out and touched the headstone, their fingers tracing the engraved letters of Ethan's name. The gesture was intimate, almost tender, and it sent chills down Sarah and Mark's spines. "This has to stop," Sarah said firmly, breaking the silence as they watched the footage together. "We need to confront them. Whatever they're doing, it's not normal." Mark hesitated, torn between curiosity and caution. Part of him wanted to believe the stranger was harmless, driven by grief rather than malice. But another part, the part that saw the haunted look in Sarah's eyes, knew they couldn't keep ignoring what was happening. If they didn't act soon, the mystery would consume them entirely. With resolve hardening in their hearts, Sarah and Mark made a decision. They would follow the stranger the next time they appeared, no matter where it led. Armed with flashlights and determination, they prepared to step into the shadows of the forest, ready to face whatever or whoever awaited them. The decision to follow the stranger weighed heavily on Sarah and Mark, but they knew it was their only chance to uncover the truth. For days, they meticulously planned every detail of their approach, knowing that one wrong move could spook the mysterious figure or put them in danger. They charged their flashlights, packed extra batteries, and even brought along a small notebook and pen in case they needed to jot down anything important during their pursuit. Despite their careful preparations, nerves still gnawed at them as they waited for the next visit. Finally, the night arrived. The camera footage showed the familiar, shadowy figure slipping into the cemetery just after midnight. This time, however, there was no hesitation. Sarah and Mark sprang into action. Wrapped in dark coats to blend into the night, they quietly made their way through the rows of headstones, keeping a safe distance behind the stranger. Their hearts pounded with each step, adrenaline coursing through their veins as they moved deeper into the graveyard. The air was cold and damp, carrying the faint scent of earth and fallen leaves. Every sound, the crunch of twigs underfoot, the rustle of wind through the trees, felt amplified in the eerie silence. Sarah clutched Mark's arm tightly, her breath visible in the frosty air. She kept glancing over her shoulder, half expecting someone or something to be following them. But the cemetery remained eerily empty save for the lone figure ahead, who moved with purpose toward Ethan's grave. As they drew closer, Sarah noticed something different about this visit. Instead of leaving an object immediately, the stranger paused by the headstone, their shoulders slumped as if burdened by an invisible weight. They reached out and touched the engraved letters of Ethan's name, lingering for several moments before finally pulling a small bundle from their coat. Whatever it was, they placed it gently atop the grave and stepped back, standing motionless as though waiting for something or someone. Mark signaled to Sarah to stay low, and together they crept closer, hiding behind a nearby tree. From their vantage point, they watched intently as the stranger knelt down once more, whispering words too soft to hear. Then, without warning, the figure turned abruptly and began walking away, not toward the main path leading out of the cemetery, but instead heading straight into the dense woods beyond. Sarah hesitated, gripping Mark's sleeve. "Should we really go after them?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Her instinct screamed at her to turn back to avoid venturing into the unknown darkness of the forest, but Mark's expression was resolute. "We've come this far," he murmured. "If we don't follow now, we may never get another chance." With that, they took a deep breath and stepped forward, plunging into the shadowy woods. The terrain quickly became uneven, roots twisting beneath their feet and branches snagging at their clothes. The moonlight barely filtered through the thick canopy above, casting everything in shades of gray and black. Still, they pressed on, guided by the faint outline of the stranger's form moving steadily ahead. For what felt like hours, but was likely only minutes, they trailed the figure, their senses heightened to every sound and movement around them. At one point, Sarah thought she heard footsteps behind them and spun around sharply, shining her flashlight into the darkness. Nothing stirred except the swaying of trees, yet the feeling of being watched lingered. Eventually, the stranger led them to a clearing where an old abandoned cabin stood. Its wooden walls were weathered and cracked, the roof sagging under years of neglect. A single candle flickered dimly in one of the windows, casting an orange glow that danced across the surrounding trees. The sight sent a shiver down Sarah's spine. It was both inviting and foreboding, like a beacon calling them closer despite its obvious decay. "Do you think they live here?" Sarah whispered, clutching her flashlight tightly. Mark shook his head. "I don't know. But we need to find out." Summoning their courage, they approached the cabin cautiously, peering inside through a gap in the shutters. What they saw inside left them stunned. The interior was cluttered with photographs pinned to the walls, dozens of them, all depicting Ethan at various stages of his life. There were pictures of him as a toddler playing in the backyard, as a young boy riding his bike, and even recent, snapshots of him hiking in the woods. Each image was accompanied by handwritten notes scrawled in shaky handwriting, detailing dates, locations, and brief descriptions of the moments captured. At the center of the room sat the stranger, a gaunt woman with sunken eyes and tangled hair. She cradled a worn journal in her lap, flipping through its pages with trembling hands. Her gaze darted between the book and the photos on the wall, her lips moving silently as if rehearsing a speech. On the table beside her lay more mementos. Additional toys, scraps of fabric, and other trinkets tied to Ethan's past. Sarah gasped involuntarily, drawing the woman's attention. Startled, the stranger rose to her feet, clutching the journal protectively against her chest. For a moment, no one spoke. The tension in the air was palpable. Then, the woman took a hesitant step forward, her voice quivering as she addressed them. "I didn't mean to scare you," she said softly. I needed to remember him." Her words hung in the silence, raw and unguarded. Sarah and Mark exchanged a glance, unsure whether to feel anger, fear, or pity. Finally, Mark found his voice. "Who are you? And why do you have all these things belonging to our son?" The woman lowered her head, tears welling up in her eyes. "My name is Evelyn," she began, her voice breaking. "I used to live near your family years ago before I moved away. I didn't know Ethan personally, but I would see him from afar, playing outside, laughing, living so fully. He reminded me of everything good in the world." She paused, struggling to compose herself. "When I heard about his death, I couldn't let go. I started collecting these things, trying to hold on to pieces of him. It's the only way I know how to cope." Sarah felt a lump rise in her throat. Part of her wanted to lash out, to demand answers about why Evelyn had invaded their lives and disturbed Ethan's memory. But another part, a softer, more empathetic side, understood the depth of grief driving her actions. "Why didn't you tell us?" Sarah asked gently. "Why keep it all a secret?" Evelyn sighed, sinking back into her chair. "Because I'm ashamed," she admitted. "I should have done more. That day, the day Ethan died, I saw him struggling on the trail. I was watching from a distance, hidden among the trees. I told myself someone else would help, that it wasn't my responsibility. By the time I realized no one else was coming, it was too late." Her voice cracked, and she buried her face in her hands. "I've been punishing myself ever since." The weight of her confession settled over the room like a heavy blanket. Sarah and Mark struggled to process what they'd just heard. Here was a woman consumed by guilt, driven to obsession by her failure to act when it mattered most. While her actions had been unsettling, even invasive, they stemmed not from malice but from profound regret. After a long silence, Mark finally spoke. "You can't change what happened," he said firmly, though his tone softened as he continued. "But maybe you can help us understand him better. Share what you saw, what you remember. Let us find some peace together." Tears streamed down Evelyn's face as she nodded. For the first time in months, Sarah and Mark felt a glimmer of hope, not because the pain of losing Ethan had disappeared, but because they realized they weren't alone in their grief. In this strange, broken connection, they found a shared desire to honor his memory and keep his spirit alive.